Okay, so last week we almost got through all the five chapters we were supposed to go over, but we didn't get to the quote-unquote leprosy, right? The passages. So, as I said, if you want to read a chapter of Leviticus, it's probably going to be chapter 12. It's 8 verses. But you probably don't want to read the next chapter, chapter 13, because it's, 59 very long verses, very long verses. So, we're not going. Needless to say, we're not going to read every word of it tonight, and we're not going to go into every little detail and minutia of every possible thing that might be labeled here as a skin disease or leprosy. But from your observations, what seems to be the point of these rules about leprosy? Okay, so good. So that's a good thing to get into, but not exactly. Is anyone else have any? Clean and unclean. Yeah.
As far as coming into worships, being close to holy God without blemish.
Yeah, so I think Neville's on the right track here. It's more about having to do with being clean when you come into the presence of God, and or even in the camp. And making sure that your uncleanness does not spread to other people so that they will not be unfit to come before God as well. Because having someone that's unclean and contaminating everything they touch is problematic. So one thing that you've probably observed is that this idea of clean and unclean is very similar to how we think about germs and diseases today. They didn't have this. They didn't know about germs back then. They didn't know exactly. They didn't know exactly how diseases were spread. Of course, there was probably a very generic knowledge. But if you know much about history, especially in the medieval period, they didn't know about sanitation. They didn't know about the need to wash your hands. They didn't know about all these things that were necessary for hygienic reasons. And not to say that they didn't ever clean themselves, but it wasn't just, they didn't know about it. They didn't have the science to back it up. And so this is probably not, so if we read this as, saying these people are being kept in quarantine, you can use that sort of analogy because it actually fits very well. If you think about, back in 2020, what happened? A lot of these procedures that they implemented, the government, the CDC implemented, you can kind of see a little bit of that in here because they're trying to contain something. So, but what they're trying to contain is different. It doesn't have to do with pathogens and germs. While diseases are about that, this is not really about that. This is about purity. Purity, a ritual purity of coming before God. So, does that make sense? Okay, and now some people, like apologists, might say that this is sort of God's way of providing them, keeping them from spreading it. Maybe it is. I can't say that it isn't, but I can say that it's probably not the primary reason God gave them these laws. But okay, another problem that we have is this term leprosy, right? When you think of leprosy, what do you think of?
Almost like zombies.
Yeah, I think these guys are like zombies. All right. So anyone else? What do you think of? Yeah, that's right. It comes to mind the people with like body parts, appendages just rotting off of their body. It's like, we have these very dramatic ideas. Maybe it's because of what people have been told in the past. Maybe it's because of movies you've seen with people depicting lepers. But it's also partially because what has been termed leprosy today is usually equated with Hansen's disease, right? So, which is not exactly what it's talking about here. So the reason why, okay, to nerd out a little bit, the reason why it's called leprosy, or translated leprosy in the Bible, is because I'm pretty sure the King James Version was just looking at this, at the Hebrew, and they're like, not exactly sure about this. So they looked at the Greek translation, the Septuagint, and they see this word lepros, which just is just the Greek word for just a generic scaly skin condition, and which doesn't have to do with that. And that's why they translated leprosy. It's sort of a transliteration of the Greek. And so that's why they have it. And today, it sort of has persisted and been a little bit shifted from that meaning, and that was happened in like the 1600s. So it can actually be this word tzara'at in Hebrew. It can be a variety of skin conditions, and some of them are given. So I think I listed several of them up here. Verse 38, it says like swelling, scabs, bright spots, boils in verse 18. In verse 24, it's a little bit unclear as to what exactly it might be, because it says or if the body sustains in its skin a burn by fire, and the raw flesh of the burn becomes a bright spot, reddish white or white, then the priest shall look at it. And if the hair of the bright spot is turned white, and it appears to be deeper than the skin, it is leprosy, or skin disease. So I don't know exactly. Maybe it's an infected burn or something. And then you have a scaly sore, you see in verse 29. So I have all these really weird things that we don't know exactly all of what they entail, but they do involve something being wrong with your skin and your flesh. And one of the things that is determined for all of these is does it turn the hair white? Right? And I did some studying on this, and there's no skin diseases that actually turn your hair white. There's nothing that does that. But so what's really probably talking about here is that it's the white flakes of your skin, the scaly skin that you have that's actually stuck to the hair. And that's really what I think what the whiteness of the hair is about. It's not that the hair itself is white, it's just covered in white flecks of dead skin. It's kind of gross, but that's what it is. In the quarantine period, we talked about that. Yes?
Just a question for you. I've always heard that, leper colonies or whatever, or if the lepers are around, they have to cover their mouth basically and say loudly, unclean, just to keep people away. And by covering their lip or their mouth, whatever, you would think it'd be because they don't want to spread whatever it is that they have, if there's screaminess, you think like COVID, and that masks, similar kind of thing. What do you think about that? That's not, that would be more of a hygienic.
Perhaps, I haven't done specific study on those verses. It could be because maybe their spit would have contaminated. As they were yelling it out, their spit would have contaminated something. And so this was another precautionary measure of something. So as I said, I'm not going to say that it wasn't a secondary reason, but I think that maybe one of the primary reasons was to prevent contamination in a ritual sense. It's what it seems to be concerned with. But you're right, that is something I'll look into. I didn't have time to look at that specific verse. And I think what is that? It's near the end of the chapter. Verse 45? Yes, right, yeah. Cover his, my translation says mustache, right? And cry, unclean, unclean. And we'll talk about, and that's if a person is unclean and they are for at least permanently or for a long period of time, they're unclean. They have to be cast out of the camp, and after they've already went to the priest several times, and they're like, yeah, you're not getting better. So they get cast out of the community because they don't want them to contaminate things. And, okay, one thing we can think about, especially as we see think about the Gospels, this definitely has a psychological and social effect, repercussions that aren't really talked about here. The whole purpose of this was to keep the sanctuary clean. It wasn't to ostracize people, to make them feel left out. But as we see in the Gospels, that's what a lot of these people felt. They weren't able to participate in the community of God. They were subject to these forces of death. And one of the things Jesus did was cleanse them. Even if we think about these guys, maybe with eczema, people just have eczema, not really painful for them. They're not going to die from it. They're just cast out of the community because of it. And they're ostracized for it. They're not able to come into contact with people. And Jesus is able to give that healing to them, healing for them socially and bodily. And that's one of the beauties of those passages where it heals lepers on a number of occasions. Are there any other comments? There's only one other thing.
One other thing, just an observation, just a different thing. The priests, whenever I think about the priests, I think of them as, they were almost like professional butchers because of the
Yep. Yeah.
sacrifices they did. I mean, they knew how to cut just right around different animals and all that stuff. But as I'm reading this, I'm thinking more so, or they are also almost like professional doctors, or I don't know what, because whenever there's anything like this, it's always go to the priest, and they have to observe these, different kind of sicknesses or whatever, like scales and all this kind of stuff. So it's just interesting to me that in addition to being like a professional butcher, they're also like almost like a physician.
Yeah.
They have to know a lot of this kind of stuff. You don't think about it as a priest.
But what keeps them from becoming infected if they are examining someone and if it is leprous, then they have to cast them out?
So, if they do touch them, they at least are conscious of it, right? So they'll go through the ceremonial washings, and I think if you touch them, they're unclean for like the next day, maybe. I can't remember the exact time, but usually it's like the next morning you're okay, or you're unclean until evening or something, and then the next day you're fine. So that's probably what happened. They would be rendered unclean, but only for a certain time if they came into contact. And it's possible that maybe they could get close enough without having to touch them, certainly. But I cannot say that I know exactly how every single thing was done back then. And even Leviticus doesn't tell you exactly how it's done. There's probably like a ton of stuff that the rabbis said. Whether it's accurate or not, I don't know, because it's written way later than Leviticus was written. But they could at least tell you some of what was at least practiced at some point in Judaism.
Ezekiel 24:17 talks about when you mourn, you cover your top lip. And also my question is that cover your lips because God's not going to talk to you.
Okay, Ash, thank you so much for reminding me of that. Thank you, Mel. That helps me a ton. So, one of the things about this is like my last point up there. If you have actually been diagnosed with this, diagnosed, look at me using this medical terminology again. Like they are told that they are unclean. Verse 44. The priest shall surely pronounce him unclean, his infection is on his head. As for the leper who has an infection, his clothes shall be torn, the hair of his head shall be uncovered, or disheveled, however you want to translate that, and he shall be cover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean. These, as Neville pointed out, these are all parts of mourning rites in Israel. I honestly forgot about the covering your lip thing about the mourning rites, so thank you for bringing that to my attention. That was very helpful. They are undergoing a sort of death because they are dying in a way. They're not able to come back into the community for at least a while. They're not able to experience the presence of God in the same way because they're not able to come before Him in their current state. So I think that's a part of what's going on here. Okay. Any other things before we move on? right, now we're on my favorite stuff. All right, the Day of Atonement. So we get the Yom Kippur Ritual. Yom Kippur Ritual coming here in Exodus chapter 16. And notice I skipped chapter 14 because there's a lot in here that's very difficult for me. I mean, even though I've read stuff on it, it's like why. Okay, like just reading verses 4 about how to cleanse the leper after he comes back and he's actually okay, his skin disease is gone. And the priest shall go outside the camp, and the priest shall look, and the infection of leprosy has been healed by the leper. And the priest shall give orders to take 2 live clean birds of cedar wood and scarlet string and hyssop for the one who has been cleansed. Why they have to take these things? It's really strange. It's really random seeming to us. The priest shall also give orders to slay 1 bird of the earthenware vessel over running water. Very specific. And as for the live bird, he shall take it together with the cedar wood and the scarlet string and the hyssop, and he has to dip them into the blood of the live bird. That is really bizarre. That's even more bizarre than all the other sacrificial stuff that goes on. So there's honestly, I mean, the stuff I've read, it says it connects to other ancient Near Eastern practices, and they take a lot of the same stuff and they change the meaning of it. But anyway, that's very difficult. But if you're interested in it, study it. Feel free to study it. It's another 57 verses on that. Okay, so on to Leviticus chapter 16, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. And notice the timing of this chapter. It's right after, Leviticus chapter 10. And chronologically, it's right after the sin of Nadav and Avihu, right? After they die. It says after they did it. He says at least he spoke to him after. I guess it doesn't say how long, but I think because they contaminated sacred space, they died in the holy place, so they double desecrated that place. Now they have to do a ritual to get rid of that impurity, the sin that is before God's presence. And so we have this Day of Atonement ritual. So first, before we get into this, I could really pour into this, but I want to hear, what are your thoughts? Do you have any thoughts or any observations? Because I might not get to it today. Any on Exodus 6 or Leviticus 16 and the Day of Atonement? No? Okay. Okay, so some of the importance of Yom Kippur. And we might not be able to delve too deeply into anything after this slide, so we might camp out here for a bit. So, what's special about the Day of Atonement is, first, there are two main rituals that are enacted. One is, or they both revolve around 2 goats, first of all. There's 2 goats, and the first goat is slaughtered as a purification offering, or sin. This is called often a sin offering. And it's used to purify sacred space, used to purify the altar. So we've read about these before. We read about these purification offerings. So what's so special about this one?
Well, there's 2 goats, right?
Yes.
One, I guess, is, the other one is the scapegoat. They let it go, or what is it they do? I can't remember. They do something to it, or then they send that goat off. I guess comes the term. He's a scapegoat.
Yeah, that's the fun verses. Honestly, it's my like the coolest ritual that they have, in my opinion. It's my favorite one personally. So we'll talk about that. Yeah, that's the second goat. But what's so special about this sin offering on this day that they do? This purification offering. First, I guess the important thing is where it purifies. It doesn't just purify the altar. It doesn't just purify the holy place in the temple or right outside of it or anything like that. It goes all the way into the very throne of God itself. It atones for sins there in the very presence of God. And this is the only time that the high priest is allowed into the Holy of Holies was on this day whenever he atones before the altar. And he gets to go before God, and God actually is dwelling and inhabiting that tent at that time. God is in the tent with him. It's what it says. He says, I am in the cloud as he is doing this. So it's, I don't know how terrifying. That's terrifying to be the high priest at this point. And that's why this is like the most important, you have to make sure you get everything right and are pleasing to God on this day, because the whole nation depends upon you as the high priest at this point. And upon the high priest, and then also upon God, of course. But it's high stakes stuff. So it's a very important thing.
So is the reason that Aaron is not allowed, or they're telling, it says, tell Aaron your brother not to come at any time into the holy place inside the veil before the mercy seat is on the ark, because God will literally be in there, in the cloud. But is it, he cannot by any means go in there in God's presence before he does the sin offering?
Yeah. And we're going to get into this. So he has to do a bull. He has to sacrifice a bull, which is he has to purify his own sins before he can purify the sins of other people. So he has to do two purification offerings technically. One is the bull for himself, and then the other one's one of the two goats then that one's for the people. So yes, and so verse 2 it does tell you he can't go in, but then he says he can go in on this occasion with a bull for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering, and then it goes into the procedure how the Day of Atonement is supposed to occur, which is sometimes it's actually it's hard to keep track of. I had to read it several times just to keep track of all the animals. I had to make a list and keep track of all these animals, which I have like a list of, let's see, if you want to look at this, there are 5 animals involved in this ritual. One is the bull, which is the purification offering for the high priest. And then there's a ram, which is the ascension or whole burnt offering that the high priest offers, and that's offered in verse 24, after everything else has already been purified, because you have to purify sacred space before you're allowed to give your ascension offering. And then you have the two offerings of the people. You have the 2 goats. One is the quote-unquote scapegoat. The other one is the one that is sacrificed and used as a purification offering. Does this make sense? Okay. So so we'll talk whenever we go into the actual outline of the day. We'll go through it in detail and probably read all the verses specifically. But today I want to focus especially on the broader theology of Yom Kippur and significance. But are there any questions so far?
It'd be intimidating for Aaron, knowing his 2 sons just got killed, and then he was going to be in the presence of God.
Yeah, it has to be terrifying. And that's what I think these Leviticus tries to instill, that the fear of God in you whenever it's talking about this. It's no light thing to do this on the Day of Atonement. It's not like he's going in there. That's why the priests weren't allowed to drink. It's like you can't mess up. You're not supposed. If you do something wrong, it has deathly consequences for you and other people possibly. Okay. Chris.
One thing I think is interesting, you may not have gotten to it yet, but the cloud that he has to create and all this sweet incense, and this enclosed area, so it's all enclosed, because that's my understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, the smoke in this little tiny little area, it's got to be overwhelming.
Yeah, it's a full sensory experience, man. So he has to get in special linen clothes. I mean, there's probably several. And the rabbinic tradition actually has him like, there are 5 times where he changes clothes, according to the rabbis, which actually is probably pretty accurate. Because of how he has to go in and out of the sanctuary, and he has to make sure he's completely pure, and he has to bathe. He bathes his hands and his feet 10 times. So every time he changes his clothes, he does it both before and after. It's bizarre. So it's a very stressful and very long and tedious day, and the high priest has to remember all these things and go through these rituals. It's very difficult. Well, no, it's all on one day. Yom Kippur is, just all one day. It does, and one thing that the Bible never specifies what time it is either, what time it takes place. So we don't know when this ritual happens. We assume it happens. It could happen at sunset, maybe, or it could happen in the morning of the day. I don't know.
Well, don't they, is it the Jewish people that they will feast the night before, or am I getting mixed up?
Not Yom Kippur. So Passover, you will do that. But Yom Kippur actually is the exact opposite. It's the only time Israel is commanded to fast ritually. Like the other times they're commanded to fast because they've done something wrong. But here they're recognizing their sin. They're to afflict themselves. If you go to the end it says in verse 29 of chapter 16, "This shall be a permanent statute for you in the 7th month on the 10th day of the month. You shall humble your souls, or afflict your life, and not do any work, whether the native or the alien who sojourns among you." So it's another Sabbath day, and they also have to. And people, they've historically understood this to be afflicting of your souls, to be fasting on that day. So it's an intense day, not just for the high priest. It's an intense day for everybody. And then there's actually a rabbinic tradition about who has to fast. Like pregnant women and children are exempt, and other people. Anyway, going on. More importantly, is the sins of the. So it really that's the first one. Is the purification happens before God and the mercy seat, like the very presence of God. It's like the worst sins that gravitate in the center of God's holiness on earth. That's purified, which is good. But then also the sins are banished through another ritual. Whenever the high priest lays his hands upon the head of the second goat, that is for Azazel, and he confesses the sins of Israel, and then in a way transfers the sins to the goat, and the goat is sent off into the wilderness with a scarlet cord tied around it, I believe. And that's my favorite. I don't know why. It's just like the coolest thing. But yeah. Yeah. People have definitely looked at how, the Christ fits this pattern for us in a way. And I'm sure you can. I'll try to find something for us to share with you all that does a good job connecting the dots there between the two. But yeah, it's fascinating. And really to end the class, this ritual is really about taking a reset button for Israel, but not just Israel. It's a reset button for all of the world, or at least prefigures it for all the world. Because I think I've talked about this before in the first couple weeks, is that the tabernacle or the temple, it is a microcosm. It is a miniature world in itself. It represents the creation of God and God dwelling in his creation. And so purifying the temple is a way of purifying the world, and it signifies and points forward to God purifying the entire world in a way, and which is another fascinating fact of how we can look to Jesus in that way, of actually fulfilling that expected role of purifying the world's sins and banishing it from the earth. And the way they did that is by sending it out into the wilderness. And the wilderness in the Hebrew Bible is generally the place where it's chaos. It is non-creation, so to speak, a place of non-existence. If we look at Genesis 1 verse 2, it talks about creation after, as for the earth, it was a, what are they? Yeah, void and empty or something like that is how translations. But you can also say it being like a wilderness as well. I think I'll do a search of how that word is used. I think it's used to describe the wilderness as chaos. Because it's a land of nothingness, land of barrenness. There's no life out there. So sending this sin out there is like sending it out there for us, almost like sending it into outer space. It doesn't exist anymore once it goes into outer space, to a certain extent, because it's not coming back. Okay, you can probably poke holes in that, like, what if it falls through the atmosphere? What if the goat comes back? You're right. The rabbis thought about that too. I guess I'll end the class with this. What if the goat came back? What did they do? Well, the rabbi said, okay, the man who led the goat off, he would kick it over a cliff. So they would guarantee it wouldn't come back. So that was their solution of what to do, and I think maybe that was meant to be a morbid sense of humor there by the rabbis. I don't know, but that just shows that kind of maybe anticipated hypothetical what happens in this situation. But as far as we know, it never happened, and it was a ritual in that respect to signify it. Yeah. Yeah, symbolically, that would be a very bad omen, right? If your sin came back to you, it would be very bad. And we're in trouble here. It would be in big trouble. All right. So, any questions? And this is just touching the surface here, and we'll get into the specifics next week.
In the future, if you ever do see the time that Christ died, the time that the goats are killed, if you see any things in the New Testament background study, that would be interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's more there's a lot of Passover language, because especially in John, when the Passover, that is when he does talk about when the Passover lambs were being slaughtered, Jesus was on trial and stuff. So it's there's a lot of Passover language. I haven't really studied the Day of Atonement stuff. That's a lot of Hebrews is especially like chapters 9 and 10. So I'll give you a look at that. Yes, Sharon. They do, yes. They don't do it. It's obviously not with any of these rituals. It's very different. And honestly, I don't know a ton. They still fast, or at least they're supposed to. And it's a day of remembering their sins as a nation.
I've heard my brother-in-law speak about the family a lot of celebrating Passover and things like that, but I don't recall in all those years hearing them talk about anything concerning consecration.
Yeah, so those are so in the fall, there's like a bunch of Jewish holidays that fall right around one another, and I get a giant break from school because of it. So you got the Feast of Booths, or Sukkot. You got Rosh Hashanah, which is like the New Year, the trumpets, I think is what it's called in the English. And then you have Yom Kippur, and then I think there's one other one that I might be missing. But yeah, they all fall around the same time. And Sukkot lasts several days, or the Feast of Booths. So anyway, they do it. I'll try to look, and I'll ask some of my friends maybe what they do on that day. All right, any other questions before we... Okay, all right. We are dismissed.